Good day. This will be our last discussion for Shakespeare's sonnets. Let's now move on to the 8 most famous words of Shakespeare in the sonnet form. So each sonnet we will discuss it briefly. So the first sonnet came from the Sonnet 18 entitled as Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So Shakespeare addresses a young man to whom he is very close. So this sonnet is considered as the most famous of all sonnets. So in here, the poet addresses a young man. So unlike from the previous sonnets, the poet glorifies the youth's beauty rather than provoke him to have a child. So however, after describing the young man's great beauty, he suggests that his poetry is eternal and ends by stating that as long as there are people who can still read the sonnet, and therefore the description of the young man's beauty will still be there. So the first 2 lines of the this sonnet remarks the youth's beauty that surpasses the summer's delight. So he emphasizes the young man's beauty. Specifically in the third quatrain, the poet says that although beauty naturally declines, the youth's beauty will not. So even death is impotent against the youth's beauty. The final couplet, if you were going to read it, it is about the poet boasting that his poetry will be eternal and the youth's beauty will be remembered forever in his sonnet. Next, the Sonnet 30, which is entitled as Went to the Sessions of Sweet Silent Thought. So in here, the narrator describes the things that people agonize over as they descend into an old age. So in here, the poet repeats the theme of Sonnet 29, which tackles about the memories of being a youth. So these memories is not only for disappointments and unrealized hopes, but for the loss of earlier friends. So this sonnet was an interesting take on aging and love as well. So all the regrets and the pain of reliving the mistakes he has made. So in this sonnet, specifically the final couplet, stresses the poet's agony. But when he thinks about his beloved, all the pain, all the regrets, and all the mistakes he has made evaporate. So that is Sonnet 30 is all about. Third is the Sonnet 33 entitled as Full Many a Glorious Morning Have I Seen. So this is a poem about loss, the loss of a loved one. So Shakespeare writes this sonnet for us to feel when the morning shines brightly, and when it's fainted by clouds, it can make the world a forlorn place. So it is stated here that when he was loved by the beloved, it was like the glorious morning, but now, having lost the beloved, it feels like an overcast and gloomy morning. So he concludes that although losing a loved one feels like an overcast or a gloomy morning, he does not condemn the beloved because human weakness is just as much part of a nature as the shrouded clouds looks like. Next is Sonnet 73, that is entitled as That Time of Year Thou Mayst in Me Behold. So the narrator of Sonnet 73 is approaching death and thinking about how different it is from being young. So all the concepts highlighted in this sonnet suggest nearing death. So the poet tends to compare himself to autumn leaves, just as he cannot determine when he will die. So the things that one gave him life have destroyed his life. So in the second quatrain of this sonnet, the poet rather describes how close he is to death. He even uses a traditional metaphor for death in the 5th and the 6th line of the sonnet. So from that experience he has learned that one has to love life as strongly as one can because it will end all too soon. So his experiences taught him to love the life he has because it will end too soon. Thus, it may also imply in this sonnet that because he may not be able to see his beloved, his love for him became stronger. The fifth sonnet is from the sonnet 104, which is entitled as "To me, fair friend, you can never be old." So it expresses the love one person has for another by showing how the beauty of the beloved doesn't change in the eyes of the lover. So Shakespeare was able to show how time passes by through the seasons and the years. Despite of that, the eyes of the lover for his beloved never changes. So he goes further by saying that no matter how long the world will endure, even though the beloved is long dead, there will never be another as beautiful. So no matter how long time were passed, no beauty or death can even outshine the beauty of his beloved. The sixth sonnet came from the Sonnet 116, which is entitled as "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment." So, um, Paul's Corinthians chapter 13 verses 48 text came from the Bible, is as well known as the Sonnet 116 because it is used in most weddings as the young couple stands before the minister. So this sonnet seems to be the response to the "what is love" question. So Shakespeare highlights that love is like an immortal force, so which encompasses the age, death, and time. But Shakespeare, in the last part of this sonnet, Shakespeare sonnet uses an amazing array of poetic devices to convey the eternal nature of love. So he even challenged the reader about his description about love. So in the final couplet, he stated that if he is wrong, then no one wrote and no one ever loved someone. So for him, so for Shakespeare, true love remains firm throughout the lives of the lover. The seventh sonnet came from the Sonnet 129 entitled as "The Expense of Spirit in the Waste of Shame." So it is an interesting take on the imperative force of lust, but its ultimate shallowness. So in here, Shakespeare explains the guilt that follow the gratification of one's lust. He stresses how lust brings out the worst in people and how far they will go. So everyone knows how shallow and guilt-producing lust is, but very few men can avoid it. So the force of lust brings joy rather, but it gives true sorrow afterwards. So according to Shakespeare, everyone know how shallow lust is, and yet no one know how to withstand one's lust. That is according to Shakespeare. So the last sonnet that became famous came from the Sonnet 130 entitled as "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." So Shakespeare is expressing the kind of love that has nothing to do with the beloved's look. So in this sonnet, the poet describes his mistress in a derogatory way, meaning in a negative way. So he expresses his admiration for her in negative comparisons as reflected in the third up to the 8th line of this sonnet, if you will going to read. What he does is invert those things, assert that his beloved is ugly, ungainly, bad-smelling, etc. But ends by saying that his love for her is as rare as that of any young man who writes flatteringly about the object of his love. But then, if we will going to observe in the final couplet, the poet emphasizes the negation of all the horrible comments that he has made. So he even described his love for her as rare, and it has nothing to do with his beloved looks like. Let us now move on to the other groupings and controversies faced by the Shakespeare sonnets. So other scholars lump the Greek sonnets with the Dark Lady sonnets and call out a different cluster as the rival poet sonnets. So in here, other scholars and critics combine the Greek sonnets with the Shakespearean Dark Lady sonnet. So sonnets from 127 to 152, and made a different cluster or group for sonnets 78 to 86 and called it as the rival poet sonnets. So this approach treats the subjects of the sonnets as characters and invites ongoing questions among scholars. So these conjectures encourages ongoing questions and speculations among scholars, since the sonnets may or may not have been autobiographical. So there is no assurance if Shakespeare wrote it based on his experiences or for entertainment and leisure only. Moreover, in 1609, Thomas Thorpe published Shakespeare Sonnets, the book Shakespeare Sonnet. So the book, however, contains a dedication by the theme, who is known as Thomas Thorpe. So, although it is accepted that Shakespeare wrote the sonnets, critics and historians question certain aspects of how the sonnets came to print. So there are rumors that some of these sonnets were circulating privately without the consent of Shakespeare. So the first book of Shakespeare sonnets contain a dedication from TT, means it has a dedication came from Thomas Thorpe. So Thomas Thorpe was known as a disreputable publisher who was known for stealing manuscripts. So that's why it faced a lot of controversies in publishing the Shakespeare sonnet. So this confounds scholars as to the identity of whom the book was dedicated to and whether the Mr. W.H. in the dedication may be the muse for the fair youth sonnet. So there are speculation who is Mr. W.H. as what I have discussed in the first session. They said it can be Henry, the Earl of Southampton, or William, the Earl of Pembroke, and lastly we have Sir William Harvey, who is the stepfather of the Earl of Southampton. So that may be the one who was portrayed as the young man for the fair youth sonnet. So we cannot know who will be the Mr. W.H. Mentioned in the dedication made by Thomas Thorpe. The dedication in Thorpe's book, if it had been written by the publisher itself, may imply that Shakespeare himself did not authorize the publication. So, historian critics believe that the first published book of Shakespeare's sonnet was printed without Shakespeare's consent. So, if this is true, it is possible that the 154 sonnets that we know today do not constitute the entirety of Shakespeare's work. Thus, there is a possibility that it can be more than 154 sonnets. Let us now move on the publishing of the Shakespeare's sonnets. A widely held belief contends that Shakespeare's sonnets were published without his consent. So as what I have said a while ago, many believe that if Shakespeare has the consent for their publication, he would have supply an authorization or an authoritative text and a dedication. So in the publication of Shakespeare's sonnet, it only contains a dedication from Thomas Thorpe. So Shakespeare's sonnets contains no dedication from the author, and the text has many errors. So since the published work of the sonnets was done by Thomas Thorpe, the text has many errors. Some critics asserted that some sonnets are unfinished and the sequence are incoherently presented to be qualified for publication. Moreover, exponents of this view have argued that someone whom Shakespeare trusted betrayed him by giving the poems to their first publisher, Thomas Thorpe, or that a thief, perhaps motivated by animosity or personal profit, seized the poet's manuscript and then sold it on. So Thomas Thorpe is the main person who first published the Shakespearean sonnets. So many believe that the reason for publishing, is for their personal profit. Next, some hold that the publication of the sonnets surely upset Shakespeare, whose poems dealt with scandalous forms of love, homoerotic, and adulterous. So Shakespeare's sonnets does not only dealt with love, aging, beauty, and death, but also tackles about the scandalous forms of love that is marked by revealing homosexual desires. So some says that the publication of the sonnets upsets Shakespeare, presumably because it was published without his consent. So others variously insist that these subjects are more shocking to post-Victorian readers than to Jacobean ones. So why? So in post-Victorian literature, the themes of the literature often depict the economic uncertainties, about faith, politics, the struggle of working people, social classes, etc. Thus, Shakespeare was a writer during Elizabethan and Jacobean ages under the Renaissance period. So literature under this period was often dark in mood. It talks about tragedies, human thought and behavior, social orders, etc. And Shakespeare's sonnets are known, or it evokes strong feelings, and it was expressed dramatically and creatively, that not only on how he write it, but the possible characters involved makes the reader to ponder more and be interested in reading the literature, specifically these sonnets. Now, let us move on who were the Shakespeare sonnets dedicated to. So, certain features of the sonnet form, not least the first-person narrative and themes of love, give the impression of offering direct access to their author's inner world. So, the sonnets give the readers the impression on what the author thinks or feels, including also their experiences. So there has long been intense curiosity about the youth addressed in the sonnets. So there are also conjectures or speculations about the youth addressed in the sonnet. So who is the youth or the young man being addressed in the sonnets? What relationship he has with Shakespeare? These are only some of the questions that leads to a lot of speculations about the Shakespearean sonnets. So moreover, the author of this dedication is T.T., also known as Thomas Thorpe, the publisher. So the author of the dedication in the first published book of Shakespeare sonnets was Thomas Thorpe. He was the first publisher who printed the Shakespearean sonnets. So, but the identity of the begetter of the sonnets, Mr. W.H., remains a mystery for all. So, the sonnets was dedicated to Mr. W.H. But who is Mr. W.H.? Some thinks that it is a misprint or a typographical error for Mr. W.S. or Mr. W.S.H. that possibly stands for William Shakespeare. Furthermore, the most widely held assumption is that the begetter must be the person who inspired the ensuing sonnets, which is the majority of which address a young man. So from the following sonnets, from Sonnet 1 to 126, we can observe that the majority of it was dedicated to a young man. But who is this young man, right? Working from the scant evidence offered by initials WH, literary detectives have proposed many candidates. First is, as what I have mentioned a while ago, it can be Henry Wriothesley, William Herbert, and we have Sir William Hervey. So, literary detectives have proposed many candidates. So, aside from Henry Wriothesley, who was the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare dedicated some of his works, including the poem Venus and Adonis, during the mid-1590s. And we also have William Herbert, who was the Earl of Pembroke, and whom Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated during the 1623. And now we also have Sir William Hervey, who was the stepfather of the Earl of Southampton and who was believed to have commissioned lyrics urging the young man to marry and produce an heir. Thus, these concepts or this notion reflect the first 17 sonnets of Shakespeare. Then, of these candidates, however, 2 were earls and 1 was a gentleman, referred to as Sir. So, as we're going to observe, Sir William Hervey was a gentleman, and the 2 other candidates were earls. Okay, one from the Earl of Southampton, and one is the Earl of Pembroke. So in the end, these probing enigmas of Shakespeare's sonnets are forced to speculate. Information is poor, scarce, and inconclusive. So, however, many conjectures and assumptions have been made, but again, none of them was proven. The information gathered wasn't enough to conclude who is Mr. W.H. and to whom the Shakespearean sonnets dedicated to. So, that's the end of our discussion about Shakespeare sonnets. So I hope you learned something from this video. So thank you for watching.